So I'll start off with the first couple questions here. So first, we just wanted to start off and ask if you can just briefly introduce yourself and tell us what you do every day at your job.
Sure. So I'm Catherine, as you know now, and I work as a localization project manager at Spotify. More specifically, I'm on the marketing localization team. So primarily in my day-to-day work, I spend a lot of time talking with stakeholders and talking to vendors to localize marketing campaigns for Spotify.
Great. And I know we kind of talked about this next question a little bit in our initial meeting, but I just wanted to ask you again for the purposes of this interview, what it was like for you to go from working on the vendor side to the client side.
Yeah, I spent a couple of years on the vendor side before making that jump. And I think like my roles there definitely did prepare me for working on the client side. I think that the skill set is primarily the exact same. There are some slight differences, but I don't know if you can hear that. Sorry, there's like a very loud motorcycle outside my
That's
apartment.
okay.
Um, yeah, it's like the skill set's pretty much the same. It's so much relationship building. It's so much advocating for localization practices, like best practices in localization. I think it's just that the dynamics are a little bit different. So like rather than working with clients when I was on the vendor side, like that shift, it was to working with internal stakeholders. And I think in that sense, it can be a little bit easier for localization to be seen as like a true partner because you're not just a vendor that they're working with. Sometimes you're like embedded with their team. So I think in that sense, it can be a little bit easier for localization to have a bigger impact.
Right. Well, thank you. I think Tulsi has the next question here.
Cool. You are muted right now, though.
Yes, I have the next question. Can I ask a follow-up to how the transition was like? Since it's kind of the same skill set and you're kind of promoting localization, evangelizing it on either side, but do you find that the language you use to explain localization on the vendor side and the client side is different? And if yes, how so?
That is a really interesting question, and I have never actually thought about it before. So
That's
my
okay.
initial answer would be maybe a little bit. I think when you are the vendor and you are trying to keep your client happy, you are a little bit, I think, more careful about explaining things really gently and making suggestions, but ultimately going along with what they ask for. And I think that when you have a partnership with internal stakeholders on the client side, you can be a little bit more direct and a little bit, I think you can come at it with like clearer, more direct language. And I think you can, not that you would be coming on strong, but I think you can like push a little more on the
Okay,
client side.
interesting. Thank you. Thank you. I know that wasn't in the questions we sent you.
No. Follow-ups are all good.
Awesome. Okay, next question. We often hear that the role of a localization PM is to put out fires and almost damage control. Is this something that you'd agree with? And if so, do you have any examples of your previous experiences?
Yeah, I jotted down some notes on this one because I think it's a really good question. And I would argue that the role is more about like preventing fires. And planning for whatever could potentially go wrong. Obviously, urgent things do come up and like emergencies happen. But I think this is why I jotted down some notes because I have a bit of a diatribe about this. But I think like unfortunately, what we've seen in the industry is like this major compression in what is considered a standard timeline really throughout the industry. And so the timelines are getting so much shorter. And so as soon as something relatively minor goes wrong with your project, it can feel like the whole thing is on fire because we haven't built in wiggle room for like human experience. Like a linguist gets sick or something gets added to the project last minute. And so it feels like things are on fire because we haven't, you know, the way that timelines are working these days is so tight. And so you feel like you have to take whatever steps necessary to fix it. And I think my hope for the industry, and I know it's kind of a pipe dream, is that like collectively we can really consider like what actually constitutes an emergency and when we actually need to be pulling out all of the stops to make something happen. Because I think we have this kind of compulsion, and I know it's on both sides, right? Like I think the clients demand things, the vendors don't want to lose the client, so they say yes, and it's this cycle. So it is like genuinely everyone, but the way it ends up is like, you know, you have one sentence added to a project and the client wants it, you know, tonight or tomorrow, and then you have your project manager staying late at work calling linguists in every time zone and waking them up at 7 a.m. or waking them up at 10 p.m. and saying, I really need you to do these 35 words in the next hour. And it's like, this shouldn't be necessary, right? Like, is that really an emergency to get this done right now? And I think a lot of companies, most companies would argue like, yeah, do whatever you can to get it done. And I obviously am a big advocate for localizing as much as possible. I want everyone to have like a localized experience available to them. But I think like there are a lot of quality implications of treating everything as urgent. And we don't need to be doing that. And I think as an industry, like it is a trend that, you know, we feel like things are on fire all the time. And I think my wish is that we could kind of collectively be better at identifying what actually is a fire and what is like just a reasonable change in a project that doesn't require, you know, emergent action. And I think I feel very grateful at Spotify that like our team is empowered to not treat every minor setback as an emergency. And we can say to our stakeholders, like, what you have requested is not reasonable. Here's what we can offer you instead. And I appreciate that a lot because I know that it's not the most common. And I really wish that it was more common in the industry. And that's kind of my hope for the industry, is to kind of take that as the more standard approach. But yeah, I think putting out fires, yes, but also I would say like preventing that from happening and, you know, trying to do your best to set up a project in a way that accounts for little setbacks and stuff.
Right. Those are great points. And I agree it should move more preventive, and what you said happens at Spotify now should become a standard. So you don't, it
Yeah.
should be more expected. Then you shouldn't have to appreciate it all the time. It should be
Yeah.
more normalized.
And I think like then sometimes you do have something even at Spotify, you know, I think it's also like we're an entertainment company. Are there any true emergencies? Like we're not, you know, doing medical interpretation here.
Right. There's a human aspect to it, and like our
Yeah,
well-being and how much work we
yeah.
can do.
But sometimes there are things that are really, you know, like at Spotify, for instance, like an example would be like, let's say an artist dies, you know, we do really quickly want to localize that, you know, whatever homepage that they're setting up. That would be considered, you know, okay, yes, let's do everything we can to get this done very quickly. But if you're doing that with everything else, then you can't put urgency on the things that are truly urgent. So I think like it's a balance.
Interesting. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on to the next question. What hard skills would help students be successful in your role that's specific to media localization? And also, have you noticed any talent gaps in the industry?
I think it's important to have experience with, or a general familiarity and comfort level with the tools that are most often used in the industry. I think Elijah and I had discussed this a little bit. in our first meeting that I think the trend now is that a lot of places have their own internal tool. So you're not going to know it before you start, right? Like Netflix's subtitle platform is internal to Netflix. So there's no way that you're going to know it before you start there. It does help, obviously, to have a familiarity with other subtitle tools. And I think kind of the same goes, or I would have a similar answer for like even just project management tools, like, you know, a familiarity with Jira. So many places use Jira. That's a good tool to have an understanding of, or even just, you know, like things like I have used Airtable in the past and like genuinely love it as a tool. And I kind of like evangelize Airtable all the time. But there's, you know, there are a lot of tools that are generally similar. You do not need to know them all. But I think once you know one, you have a good understanding of the rest. And I think so much of this is going to be specific to each company, and they're not going to expect you to know these tools when you begin. Of course, it could be a plus. I would say there are places that would like you to know Jira before starting. I have seen that. But a lot of it is learned on the job. And I think it's not the same way that it was, you know, 10 or 15 years ago when every linguist needed a Trados license or their own version of MemoQ, right? Like the trend is towards cloud-based systems. Linguists are given a login, they sign on, and they complete their work there. So I think it's great to have a solid knowledge about, you know, in general, the tools that are being used in the industry. It's probably just as important to understand like the trends overall and just like have an understanding of how to learn these tools and a comfort level of learning them. And then, you know, like a lot of soft skills that are required for these roles. I think the exception would be in internationalization spaces where way more people there do have experience as engineers, and there are much more specific hard skills that you do use in your day-to-day, but that's not my area of expertise, so I don't really know about that as much. But I think like in the media world, I think, you know, when I started at Netflix, I did not know almost anything about subtitles. I do think that that's different now, and there should be some understanding of, you know, general specs and guidelines and how these things work. But I don't think there are any specific, like really specific necessary tools that you have to know. And in terms of talent gaps, I think like nothing really jumps out. I think just like it's primarily just really important to be a critical thinker and like think when you see a problem, like trying to think of a creative way to solve it, or, you know, thinking critically about what the root cause is and how to, you know, like create a solution. That's kind of not a hard skill or a soft skill. It's kind of in between. But yeah, I don't think there are like, in my experience, maybe there are talent gaps, but I think a lot of it is just like we're all learning a lot on the job. So it's not so much going into it being an expert necessarily in subtitling or in media localization, though that helps and comes with experience. But when you're just starting out, obviously, you know, you're not going to be an expert in everything. But I do think like having like really good critical thinking skills is kind of the utmost importance.
That's good. Like here at Miss, we have the audiovisual class that helps us a lot in it. We work in Premiere a lot, and there's a lot of subtitling tools that are introduced to us.
Yeah.
So it's great. But yeah, we usually have a week or two at one tool, and we're like, how are we going to learn how to use this? But I think what you just said is important. It's like it's more about if we're able to navigate and figure it out as we're using it, more than you don't have to master this tool and then it'll change based on the industry. So that's really cool to hear from you.
Yeah. I think also like something I would add to that I've noticed in a few jobs is like questions are great. You're going to have a lot of questions when you start anywhere. And I think almost 100% of the time you should be asking those questions. But I think what's really important and what is really appreciated at these jobs where things are really fast paced and like training is kind of happening while you're starting to take on projects. And, it can be a little bit of like, you just get thrown in the deep end. I think what's really, really important is like when you're asking a question, show that you've done some work first to understand or to find out the answer on your own. So I think like that is something that I always appreciate so much. When I was a PM at Netflix and there were contractors like working as coordinators on my projects, I think something that I appreciated so much was, someone saying, hey, I'm not really sure what to do about this. Here's what I think. Here's what I looked up. Here's what I found. I think I should do that. I think having this ability to kind of like self-serve knowledge and try to find a solution and then absolutely ask the question, but do what you can first to find out for yourself.
Great, thank you. Next questions, I'll hand it off to Nora.
Thank you. So the question which is next is kind of based on a previous question. And what do you think are helpful resources or ways for fresh graduates like us soon to improve their capabilities and visibility in the job market?
Yeah, I think I'm sure you all know this and it's been talked about in your classes, and I'm sure it's come up, like networking is so important in this industry in particular. But I think I would caveat that with like going to an event or connecting with someone on LinkedIn with the overt goal of like, I'm trying to find someone who will give me my next job is very transparent and it doesn't work. And everyone in the industry, I think, has like gotten a random LinkedIn message from a stranger asking for a job, and those messages do not get responses, right? So my advice would be like, find things that genuinely interest you, find events that genuinely interest you, and make connections with people who you genuinely want to have like real conversations with, ask specific questions, and go into it with like the interest of learning more and gaining more experience and like honing your expertise. And I think it can be really easy to find events that are related to aspects of the industry that interest you, or even like events outside of the localization industry where like there's some overlap or places that you want to learn more. And there are also like localization groups and meetups in so many cities, and also virtually. And I think those are really great places to join in and like ask questions, learn whatever you can, and make connections in those spaces. And then I think like absolutely use the resources that are available to you at MIS, like do practice interviews and edit your resume to like highlight what experience you do have. I think like obviously it can be really hard when you're first starting to learn like how to sell yourself, especially when you don't have a ton of experience yet and you have to kind of like sell yourself as a candidate. But I think generally like the industry is really enthusiastic, and generally really welcoming. So I think like be present on LinkedIn, like go to events or find forums and, like ask questions and make connections that way. And definitely like use the MIS network, and the resources that MIS has available, like practice interviews and things like that. Like I think that is one of the best ways to become visible and to kind of understand what's going to help you stand out as a candidate.
Do you have any like maybe books about localization or internalization which you find like helpful?
What a good question, because I read so much and I read so many language books, but I don't really read a lot about the industry. But we actually have at Spotify like a little corner in our office, as we're calling it, our little like localization library, and people leave books there that they've been reading. So I'm gonna reach out to the team and see what they recommend, and I'll email you guys after.
Oh, that would be really cool. It's just like such a spontaneous question. Yeah, sorry about it. It's just like was
Yeah, no,
just
It is a good question because I think, you know, because I have read a lot of, like books about language. But I think the industry moves so quickly that by the time a book is published, like things are already potentially really different. So, yeah, but there are also like plenty of journals and like online resources that have really good information. So I'll do some digging and I'll send you guys a list of some recommendations.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
And how have your daily routine changed since moving from the project coordinator role at Netflix to the project manager role at Spotify? How was this shift? Was it easy to manage or not really? And just in general, like how your coordinator role shift to a manager leadership role was like experienced.
Yeah, I think actually, so I actually became a project manager a few months into my tenure at Netflix. So that transition was part of my time there. I think I joined the team at a time when we were essentially a team of coordinators, and with some internal changes, we ended up kind of all becoming a team of project managers with some, because there had been like reorgs. And so as a team, we all kind of were making this shift together. But if I'm being honest, like I think before the shift officially happened, we were still doing the role of project management. So I think it wasn't like a sudden thing. I think like the main difference is that as a coordinator, a lot of your work is really tactical. Like you're setting up projects in the system, you're updating trackers, maybe you're dealing with invoicing. You're doing kind of like the really important, like day-to-day tactical stuff involved with working on projects. I think as a project manager, you do still do that stuff. And especially if you're at a company that does not have coordinator roles, like Spotify does not have coordinators. But the work is more strategic overall. So you're in more meetings with stakeholders, you're involved way more upstream, you're influencing like localization decisions much more strategically. And I think because of that, you have to have a wider view of your role and your work, because you're not just focused on executing on, your current projects. You're thinking about the future and how you can improve the processes and how you can scale in the future. So I think the main shift is like going from a little bit more tactical to a little bit more strategic, and just being involved in like bigger projects and bigger conversations. And then because of that, you have a little bit more impact, and I think you're a little bit more visible in that role.
Thank you. I also have a small follow-up question, just
Sure.
because the companies are really very different, like Netflix and Spotify. There is a huge difference between I would assume you concentrated more probably on subtitling and dubbing on Netflix, right? And right now you are mostly concentrating on music localization. Is there like a big difference between these two like industries?
Yes and no. I think like, yes, the day-to-day work, like the actual projects that I'm working on are quite different, but I think kind of across localization, there are going to be kind of like the same themes and the same skill sets and the same kind of, let's say, issues that could come up. And so, yeah, at Netflix, I was focused on subtitling. We had a separate dubbing team that was part of post-production, and I worked closely with them, but my main focus was subtitling and subtitles for the deaf and hard of hearing. And at Spotify, my main focus is marketing translation. So like, experiences within the app that are, marketing campaigns or like marketing emails, like, you've only listened to 80% of the new Beyonce album, finish it now, like that kind of thing. So localizing things about music. And it definitely, I would say one difference is like in subtitling, you have to have a little bit more background knowledge and context of like subtitling, localization, and media and television, and like how the process, you know, how things even get to the subtitling stage, right? Like you have to have, you learn about, you know, what happens in post-production and, you know, the creative process and editing and things like that. Whereas at Spotify, I work on marketing localization and I have a big interest in music, but I do not have to have a huge background on how the music industry works in order to do my job successfully. So I think that is kind of a difference. But like overall, a lot of the themes are the same, even if the projects are quite different. I'm just gonna turn my video off for 1 second because I have to plug in my charger. 1 second. Okay, there we go.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, Elijah, I'll give you a word.
Thank you. So as you can see here from our backgrounds, our project name is called LocReady, and so that means localization ready. So I guess we kind of wanted to ask, like, in your view, what makes a person loc ready, which is to say, like, what kind of advice would you give to people who just have recently graduated or will be graduating soon?
Yeah, I think it's so hard because, you know, I wish there was like a couple pieces of advice that are like really specific, like you need to do this, right? Or like you need to know this specifically, and that will help you. But I don't, I was thinking about it, and I really don't think that that exists. Like there isn't one piece of advice that everyone, you know, I think it's, the industry is so nebulous and it just depends so much on where you are and like your experiences and the job and the requirements for like each specific role. But I would say like if I had to come up with something, I think flexibility is probably one of the most important traits that a person can have in this industry. I think it's like, you know, an ability to prioritize and figure out how to prioritize things. You know, at some point you're going to be at a job where every person who is requesting something of you thinks that their job is just as important as the others, and you have to prioritize all of them because it can't all happen at once, right? So I think flexibility and ability to prioritize and understand the bigger picture is one of the most important things. And I think it's equally important, like as a project manager, you have to have really good attention to detail. But you also equally have to have the ability to like zoom out and see, you know, the whole picture. So I think like in terms of being loc ready, I think there's not like one piece of advice, but I would say like it's great that you will all be graduating with a really solid foundation and like understanding of the industry. And I think just like continuously keep learning and building on that as you go. I think being a good problem solver will get you really far, and like being creative in problem solving is really helpful. And I think it's, you know, especially when you're starting out, right? Like I think it's really important to balance, you know, this, you know, that like you're new and you don't know everything. And I think you can feel like maybe you don't have as much to offer because you're new and you're still learning so much. And it's good to, you know, be humble, but I think also you you have to have the confidence that, you know, like you do know a lot and there's a lot that you can offer with a fresh set of eyes at a company. And I think that you can be really impactful from the beginning. And I think that that's something that like we forget sometimes. And I think, you know, you were probably going to see that through the course of your career when you're starting any new job. And I think like, in my experience, like that is very common for women in particular to feel kind of a sense of like imposter syndrome. I think that's something that everyone talks about at like every job I've ever been at. So I think it's something to be mindful of, right? Like, you know, yes, you're new and you're just starting out and you have, you know, less experience, but I think it's important to also kind of understand, like, you're going into it with a really solid foundation. And if you can learn quickly on the job, you can be really impactful from the beginning.
That's really good advice. Thank you. I kind of had a follow-up question on that too. Because thinking about myself personally, like how I don't currently have too much experience in the field, and going right from graduating into a full-time job, I kind of wanted to ask, just going off of that, what would you suggest how to convey that we don't have too much experience as of yet, but that we have these skills?
I think a lot of that is going to be in your resume, and like finding ways to highlight experience in your coursework, and ways to highlight like tools that you're familiar with, workflows that you're familiar with. Like, a lot of it is going to be down to like conveying that in an interview. And obviously you have to get the interview first. So I understand that can be kind of difficult, but I do think that having a degree helps, right? Like, that is going to open doors for you. And then the Ms. network will also open doors for you. And I think I personally hate cover letters, and I think that they're stupid, and I don't think that jobs should require them. And I frankly don't think that anyone reads them, but I could see the utility when you're just starting out as using that as a way to kind of say, I have studied these things, and I have experience, learning about these things. So that could be potentially useful, but I would hesitate to say like spend a lot of time on a cover letter. And actually, my advice would be have a template for any job that I've ever applied to that requires a cover letter. I have a template. I swap in a few key details depending on the role. Don't spend too much time on that.
That's very good. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think we're pretty good on time, so I think I'm gonna go over to Tulsi to start with some of the bonus questions that we had.
Yay. I'm gonna skip to the second one. One of our other members that couldn't be here was particularly interested in this.
Sure.
How did you decide to pursue a career in localization after getting a TI degree and being a freelance translator?
Yeah, I'm just going to be very frank in this answer, because I think that's important. I ended up pursuing project management because I have a chronic health condition that requires good health insurance, and it requires expensive medication. And, I never felt like I missed out on any part of my career, or on anything because of, my medical history, but it does impact like the reality of my situation, which is that, setting up a freelance practice takes a lot of time, and it does not offer the same stability that a role in localization management offers. And I live in New York City. It's an expensive place to pay rent, and freelancing is not. Obviously, people make it work, and it's a great career, and I have done it, and I have done it on the side, even in my localization project management roles. But yeah, for me, I think it was a practical decision. And like, obviously I love my job, and I'm really fortunate to be doing something that I enjoy, and I'm like really happy with my situation and my career, and I think it's gone very well. But I also think it's like important to normalize the idea that like not every career decision is a result of like immense passion for the work. And so I made a really practical decision to pursue roles in the industry that would kind of meet my particular needs.
Right.
And obviously it's,
This path was the more sustainable option for you and your lifestyle.
exactly.
So you kind of fell into it and learned.
Yeah. And I think like there are so many people that fall into this industry in general, right? Like, even as, as translators and as project managers, etc. Like, I think this industry is really accommodating to people who kind of end up here accidentally.
That makes sense. Can I guess, ask a question that's different but still related to freelance translation. How does having that translation experience help you work? I guess you worked with linguists on the vendor side, but also how does it help you on at Spotify as well?
I think like being a freelance linguist informed a lot of how I approach project management, and being a project manager informs a lot of how I have approached freelance work, in that, like, you know, when you've been on both sides, you have a bit of a deeper understanding, and I think a little bit more empathy as well for the other side, right? I think it can be really easy to get frustrated sometimes with like, this linguist is late on this assignment, or, you know, this project manager isn't giving me all the information I need, and how am I possibly going to translate it with, you know, this amount of information. So I think like my experience in both roles has helped me in the other role. I think it helped me understand how important it is to like set expectations and be as clear and concise as possible, and like, you know, convey the information that is necessary and not much more than that, so as to avoid like things getting lost. I think in terms of like my work at Spotify, on the client side, localization teams are seen as, you know, kind of the experts and kind of consultants on cultural questions. And we are often, you know, will be sent copy that is being considered, you know, like maybe before a marketing campaign is finalized, we'll get the copy and we can say, hey, like, just for instance, this idea that you've gone with, or this sentence, is not going to be culturally relevant for all of the market, so you might want to play with that. Or even like, I remember like a very simple example of this was like, someone had requested a translation for a marketing campaign, and they didn't initially say that it involved an animation with words in it, and the word, it was, I don't remember the exact context, but like the words were cut up in a way that you could not localize this and keep the animation. And we didn't know this we knew this campaign was coming, but we did not know that this piece of it existed. And we had to kind of right away be like, oh, sorry, if we had seen this earlier, we would have let you know that this is impossible. And I think like kind of similarly with, you know, experience with language and working as a linguist, like being able to consult on that kind of thing, and being able to say, hey, this idea isn't going to work in all of the markets that we need it to, so let's like rethink. So I think it can be really helpful in that sense, and can definitely lend you some more impact when you're explaining, you know, why something may or may not work. So I think it's, you know, and I think even, you know, on every team that I've been on, there are people who are not fluent in another language, who do not have a lot of people do have experience as linguists as well, but there are a lot of people who don't in the industry, and there are a lot of people who don't speak other languages, and they also are great at their jobs, and it, you know, it's fine. But it can help in some situations to just know, you know,
Right.
how to consult and how to.
That makes sense. You understand like the path it's going down and where it's going to end up, so you can.
Exactly.
And you're like, I think here we hear a lot, like, do you want to start on the vendor side? Do you want to start on the client side, or start one and then transition to another, so you get the best, so you understand the best practices on both sides? But there's also one other side of being the linguist, so you have perspectives from all three, and that's probably why you give such great advice.
I think it does, like it does really help. I think like it really helps in terms of just like feeling, honestly, like feeling empathy for other experiences, and like it can help you kind of learn to pivot a little bit more easily. So I think, yeah, it's good to have had experience in all of those aspects.
Awesome. Thank you. Nora, do you want to ask another question if we're still good on time.
Yeah, sure. What is the greatest thing about working in Spotify?
Hmm. Um, music is good. Free Spotify account is nice. No, I think like I spend my day doing really interesting work that I really like. I genuinely enjoy the work that I do, and I'm surrounded by really brilliant and hilarious and kind coworkers, and I genuinely enjoy, you know, working with them and learning from them. And I think we have a really great team, and it's a really collaborative space. But I think also like something that I truly appreciate is that then, at the end of the day, I know that it's just a job. And I think this is like a mix of like lessons learned and maybe gaining some more experience in setting boundaries now that I'm more comfortable in my career. And then also it's kind of the general attitude at Spotify that like work-life balance is really important. So like when I sign off for the day, I do not think about work, and I go about my life, and I have hobbies, and I, on my evenings and my weekends, I'm doing things that have nothing to do with my job. And that is not my experience at a lot of places previously in my career. So I think that's like what I'm the most grateful for at Spotify is like, I love what I get to do during the day. And I also love that I do not have to do it 24/7.
Yeah, it's great when you can just easily switch and turn off from your job.
It's very nice. And it's not the case everywhere. And I think that is like some advice I would give you is just be mindful of when you're starting out in your careers, like do try to, and it's really difficult to do, but like do try setting some boundaries if you can, because I think it can be really easy to get kind of swept into this idea that work is everything and you need to be available all the time to, finish this project or answer this question from a linguist who's based in Japan or, somewhere that's not a conducive time zone to stopping work on time. And I think there's no avoiding that sometimes, but like my advice would be like, try from the start to be mindful about that and like set some good work-life boundaries so that you don't burn out.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think I don't have actually any follow-up questions. So, Elijah, do you want to wrap up a meeting?
Yeah, sure. I think we had one more question here, and I think we've kind of touched on it a little bit, but not in too much detail. So I guess I wanted to ask, looking back on how you got where you are today, is there
Mm.
anything that you would have done differently or wish you had previously known?
Um, no, I think, I'm a little, sometimes I fall into this kind of woo-woo bullshit of being like, I'm just grateful for my journey. But I think like, no, my experience in the industry has been like genuinely really positive. And I think if I had to choose something, I would have been a little bit more firm about setting some work-life balance boundaries earlier. And I would have maybe not, I think this is a leftover from time as a freelancer is, you get, when you're freelancing, it can be very feast or famine. And so when there are projects available, you feel the need to take all of them because you don't know when the next, you don't know if it's going to be a while before the next one comes, right?
Mhm.
And I think that I had kind of adopted that as a general practice in my life, and I, with all work stuff. And so I was, I would, you know, maybe take a job that I didn't feel was right for me, but felt like, well, you know, I need something and I don't want to wait and miss an opportunity, So I think I would maybe be a little bit more firm about, the right fit and like setting some boundaries. But I think like overall, um, it's it's gone well. So I don't have anything that I like necessarily wish I would have done differently or knew previously.
That's great. And I think like for recent grads, that's definitely something that we should keep in mind because I feel like as a recent graduate, something comes along, we'll take like the first thing that we
Yeah.
get offered, as opposed to really considering
Yeah.
what we would need out of a job and our own work-life balance. So that's
Yeah.
really good to keep in mind.
I think it is something that's really important to keep in mind. And I also like fully understand that I'm coming at that with the privilege of like having more experience. And so I now am at a point in my career where I feel more comfortable being a little bit more choosy. And I know that that's not how it feels when you're just graduating. And especially if there's, if you're an international student who needs to find a job that will sponsor your visa, or if you, like really want to live in a particular city and this is the only company with a localization team there, like I think there are so many factors that weigh on these decisions to work for certain places. So I am definitely like sensitive to that, but I think, yeah, like if you get a bad feeling from the interview, or you if it seems like people who work at this company are not happy, I think, try not to panic and accept you don't, if you can wait, and I know that's not an option for everybody and everyone wants a job. And I know it's like, it can be a scary economic climate and all of this. So, I don't want to say like, wait for your dream job, but like, try to keep a balance, I think.
That's really good to know. Thank you. Well, I think those were all the questions that we had in our list, unless there's anything else that Nora or Tulsi wanted to ask.
I think it's good. Thank you so much for joining us.